There is a specific sound a billionaire makes when they look at you and see absolutely nothing. It isn't a laugh. It's an exhale. A dismissal. She looked at my rusted '69 Mustang, smiled, and called it a piece of junk. 30 seconds later, I engaged the bypass. The concrete cracked, the air pressure dropped, and her smile evaporated into the exhaust. The mop water was always gray by midnight. Arthur leaned his weight into the wringer, listening to the heavy, wet slop of dirty water cascading back into the plastic bucket. His lower back screamed a dull, chronic ache that had moved in 3 years ago and never packed its bags. The underground parking garage of the Apex Tower was dead quiet, save for the rhythmic squeak of Arthur's rubber-soled boots and the low, synthetic hum of the fluorescent tubes overhead. The air down here tasted like dried concrete and old rubber. He pushed the yellow cart down, level B4, the VIP level. The floor here wasn't standard asphalt. It was an epoxy resin, poured smooth and polished to a mirror shine, so the executives wouldn't have to scuff their Italian leather shoes before reaching the private elevators. Arthur hated the resin. It showed every single smudge. Over in the corner, tucked behind a structural pillar, sat Arthur's car, a 1969 Ford Mustang Fastback. The body was a bruised primer gray, speckled with rust spots that looked like dried scabs. The front left fender was slightly crumpled, and the chrome bumper was pitted and dull. It looked like a corpse waiting for a tow truck. Inside the passenger seat, wrapped in a faded plaid blanket, his 8-year-old son Leo was asleep. The boy's breath fogged the glass. It was a Tuesday. The babysitter had bailed. Again. Arthur dragged the mop in a wide figure eight, his eyes darting back to the Mustang every few minutes. Just a little longer. 2 more rows. Then he could clock out, carry Leo up to the cramped apartment, and sleep for exactly 4 hours before the sun came up. A soft chime echoed through the cavernous space. The brass doors of the private elevator slid open. Out walked Evelyn Hayes. Even at midnight, the CEO of Apex Industries looked weaponized. She wore a tailored ivory pantsuit that defied the grime of the city. Her heels clicked against the resin's sharp, authoritative cracks like a metronome, setting the pace for the rest of the world to follow. She smelled of bergamot, crisp paper, and something entirely sterile. Behind her walked a man in a dark suit, carrying a leather briefcase, his eyes fixed firmly on the back of her head. Arthur stopped mopping. He pulled the cart to the side, pressing his back against a cold concrete pillar to make himself invisible. It was a survival reflex. Janitors were ghosts. If they saw you, it usually meant you were doing something wrong. Evelyn walked toward her designated spot, where a sprawling, custom-built electric Maybach waited, silent and predatory. But halfway to her vehicle, she stopped. She turned her head. Her eyes locked onto the corner by the pillar. She saw the Mustang. Arthur's chest tightened. He gripped the wooden handle of the mop until his knuckles turned white. Evelyn detoured. She walked slowly toward the old Ford, her expression pulling into a tight, fascinated sneer. She stopped a few feet from the grill. She looked down at the floor. A single, dark bead of fluid had pooled on her immaculate resin floor beneath the Mustang's undercarriage. "Richard," Evelyn said. Her voice didn't echo. It was low, raspy, and carried an absolute expectation of being heard. The man in the suit scurried forward. "Yes, Miss Hayes?" "What is this?" She didn't point. She just stared at the car. "It appears to be a vehicle belonging to the maintenance staff, ma'am. I can have it towed immediately." Arthur swallowed the lump of bile rising in his throat. He stepped out from the shadow of the pillar. The wet squeak of his boots sounded deafeningly loud. "It's mine, ma'am. I'm sorry." Evelyn slowly turned her head. She looked at Arthur. She didn't look at his face. Her eyes scanned the stained gray uniform, the calloused hands gripping the mop, the sweat drying on his forehead. She categorized him in a fraction of a second, filed him away in a drawer labeled expendable, and then looked back at the car. "You're leaking," she said. "It's condensation," Arthur lied. His voice cracked. He hated himself for the crack. He hated the way his shoulders instinctively hunched in her presence. "I'll clean the floor before my shift is over. It won't leave a stain." Evelyn tilted her head, observing the rusted hood of the Mustang. A breathy, dismissive sound escaped her lips. It was half chuckle, half sigh, a laugh devoid of any humor. "It's junk," she stated flatly, as if reading a quarterly report. "Why do you people insist on keeping things that are broken? It's a psychological defect. Holding on to scrap metal because you think it has character. It doesn't have character. It's just a decaying piece of trash bleeding oil onto my floor." Arthur's jaw locked. He felt the hot spike of adrenaline hit the base of his skull. 1,000 words rushed to his tongue. He wanted to tell her what was under that rusted hood. He wanted to scream at her. But then he saw a small movement in the corner of his eye. Leo shifted in the passenger seat, his small face pressing against the foggy window. The boy's eyes were open, watching his father. Arthur deflated. The anger drained out of him, replaced by the heavy, suffocating weight of reality. He needed the dental insurance. Leo's braces were due next month. "You don't scream at the CEO when you need the dental insurance." "I'll move it to the upper lot tomorrow, Miss Hayes," Arthur said. His voice was hollow, defeated. Evelyn didn't acknowledge the apology. She had already lost interest. She turned on her heel and walked toward her Maybach. "See that you do, and scrub that spot twice. It smells like poverty over there." She slid into the back of her silent, pristine car. The doors closed with a heavy, airtight thud. The Maybach glided out of the garage, a ghost in the night, leaving Arthur alone with the mop and the echoes. He stood there for a long time. He looked at his shaking hands. They were raw, split at the knuckles from cheap industrial soap. He walked over to the Mustang, pulled a rag from his back pocket, and wiped the single drop of condensation from the floor. It wasn't oil. It was water, the cooling byproduct of a system she couldn't even begin to comprehend. He threw the rag in the trash, opened the heavy steel door of the Mustang, and slid into the driver's seat. "Dad?" Leo mumbled, rubbing his eyes. "Are we going home?" Arthur looked at his son. He reached over, running a rough hand through the boy's messy hair. "Yeah, buddy. We're going home." He inserted a jagged brass key into the ignition. He didn't turn it all the way. He just clicked it to the battery setting. The dashboard didn't light up with analog dials. Instead, a concealed matte black LCD strip hidden beneath the vintage steering column flared to life. Lines of complex telemetry scrolled rapidly across the tiny screen. Pressure gauges, thermal capacity, magnetic resonance stability. Arthur took a slow, deep breath, smelling the familiar scent of old vinyl and ozone. "Junk," he whispered to himself in the dark. He turned the key the rest of the way. The engine didn't roar. It didn't rumble. It inhaled. When Arthur turned the key, a deep sub-bass vibration shook the floorboards of the Mustang, a frequency so low it bypassed the ears and vibrated directly in the sternum. It was the sound of a massive, suppressed kinetic force waking up. To anyone outside the car, it sounded like a poorly tuned exhaust system, rattling against an old frame. The auditory illusion was intentional. Arthur eased the car out of the Apex Tower garage and onto the rain-slicked streets of the city. He hated driving it like this, choked, muffled, limping along in first gear, forcing the revolutionary piece of technology under the hood to mimic the dying gasps of a fossil fuel relic. But he had no choice. If the world knew what Arthur Pendleton had built, they wouldn't give him a medal. They would take it. The wipers squeaked against the glass, smearing the neon reflections of late-night convenience stores. "Did that lady yell at you?" Leo asked. He was sitting up now, the plaid blanket pooling around his waist. "No," Arthur said softly, keeping his eyes on the road. "She just didn't like where I parked. It's fine." "She looked mean." "She's just busy, Leo. Rich people are always in a hurry to get nowhere." Arthur gripped the thin, cracked steering wheel. His mind drifted, as it often did on this drive, to the before the medical bills. Before his wife Sarah had faded away in a sterile hospital room, leaving Arthur with a mountain of debt and a grieving 4-year-old. Before he had been forced to liquidate his engineering firm, sell his patents to vultures, and take a job pushing a mop just to maintain basic health coverage. Arthur wasn't a mechanic. He was a theoretical propulsion engineer, and for the last 4 years, in the damp, freezing confines of his rented duplex garage, he had been building his masterpiece. It was a closed-loop, magnetic resonance thermal engine. It didn't burn gas. It didn't rely on lithium-ion grids. It harvested kinetic energy, amplifying it through a supercooled magnetic field, creating a self-sustaining torque loop. It produced zero emissions. It ran virtually cold. And the horsepower it generated was, on paper, terrifying. It was the holy grail of localized energy. A $2 billion paradigm shift bolted onto the rusted chassis of a salvaged '69 Mustang. He put it in the Mustang because nobody steals a rusted Mustang. Nobody looks twice at it. To the world, it was just a poor man's broken dream. To Arthur, it was a vault. They arrived at the duplex. The neighborhood was a grid of decaying mid-century homes. Front lawns turned to dirt, chain-link fences sagging under the weight of overgrown ivy. Arthur pulled the car into the detached garage at the back of the property and killed the engine. The sub-bass hum whined down, sounding like a jet turbine spinning to a halt, before ending in a heavy metallic clunk. He carried Leo inside. The boy had fallen asleep again. Arthur laid him on the twin bed, pulled off his sneakers, and draped a heavy quilt over him. He stood in the doorway for a moment, watching his son's chest rise and fall. The crushing guilt of inadequacy pressed down on Arthur's chest. He had a machine worth billions sitting 30 feet away, yet he had to check his bank balance before buying a gallon of milk. He was terrified of selling it. The last time he trusted corporate investors, they stole his designs and buried them in litigation. He needed to perfect it, patent it ironclad, and find the right buyer. Until then, he was trapped in purgatory. Arthur walked to the kitchen, poured himself a glass of tap water, and stared out the window at the dark garage. "It's just a decaying piece of trash." Evelyn Hayes's voice echoed in his head, dripping with that effortless, aristocratic disgust. Arthur gripped the edge of the cheap laminate counter. He was tired of swallowing his pride. He was tired of the gray water and the smell of ammonia. He set the glass down, walked out the back door, and headed into the garage. He didn't turn on the overhead lights. He grabbed a heavy flashlight from the workbench, popped the hood of the Mustang, and propped it up. The beam of light hit the engine bay. It was a chaotic masterpiece. There was no standard engine block. Instead, a cylindrical housing made of brushed titanium and scavenged aerospace-grade ceramics dominated the space. Thick, braided cables pulsed with a faint, bioluminescent blue coolant. Copper induction coils wrapped tightly around the primary drive shaft. It smelled of ozone, clean and sharp, like the air right after a violent lightning storm. Arthur reached out and placed his calloused hand flat against the titanium housing. It was ice cold. He grabbed a socket wrench and spent the next 3 hours underneath the car, tightening the bypass valves, adjusting the magnetic seals. He was tired. His eyes burned. But here, with grease on his hands and the smell of solder in the air, he wasn't a ghost. He was a god. By 4 a.m., he crawled out from under the chassis. He wiped his hands on a greasy rag, leaving streaks of black across his palms. He looked at the rusted shell of the car, and then he smiled. It was a dark, cynical smile. "Let him think you're junk," he whispered to the car. "We know what you are." 3 weeks later, the sky over the city tore open. It wasn't just rain. It was a biblical deluge, a violent, unseasonal squall that dumped 4 inches of water an hour onto an infrastructure utterly unprepared for it. The storm drains choked immediately. The sky turned a bruised, ugly purple, and the streetlights flickered before dying completely as the grid buckled under the strain. Arthur was driving home from a day shift. He had picked Leo up from school early because the district was shutting down. The Mustang was handling the weather perfectly. The heavy chassis cut through the standing water on the asphalt, the heavy tread tires finding grip where modern, lightweight cars were hydroplaning into ditches. The traffic on the I-95 overpass was a nightmare. Cars were gridlocked, brake lights bleeding red through the torrential downpour. Arthur sat in the right lane, the windshield wipers slapping furiously. The interior of the Mustang was warm. Leo was in the passenger seat, playing a game on a cracked smartphone. "Dad, look," Leo said, pointing out the window. Arthur leaned forward, wiping a patch of condensation from the glass. A quarter mile ahead, at the lowest dip of the overpass where the drainage had completely failed, a massive pool of muddy water had collected. It was easily 3 feet deep and rising, and dead in the center of it, entirely stranded, was a long, sleek, ivory Maybach. The water was lapping at the doors. The hazard lights were flashing weakly, fading fast. Arthur recognized the license plate. Apex 1. He tapped the brakes, slowing the Mustang as he approached the edge of the flood zone. Other cars were carefully turning around, driving the wrong way up the shoulder to escape the rising water. Nobody was stopping. It was every man for himself. Arthur stared at the stranded luxury vehicle. Through the rain-streaked rear window of the Maybach, he could see the silhouette of Evelyn Hayes. She was on her phone, pacing the cramped back seat, her composure fracturing. Her driver was standing waist-deep in the muddy water, desperately trying to open the hood, but the electronic latches had shorted out. The $300,000 piece of cutting-edge technology was now a 6,000-pound paperweight. A dark, petty part of Arthur's soul whispered to him, "Drive past. Let the billionaire ruin her shoes. Let her smell like wet asphalt and panic." He remembered her dismissive laugh in the garage. He remembered the way she had looked at him like he was a stain on her floor. He took his foot off the brake. The Mustang crept forward. He was going to bypass them on the high embankment. "Dad, they're stuck bad," Leo said softly, his eyes wide. "The water's going to get inside." Arthur stopped the car. He closed his eyes and sighed. A long, jagged breath. He gripped the steering wheel, fighting a violent internal war between his pride and his humanity. He cursed under his breath. He hated that he had a conscience. "Stay in the car, Leo. Do not open the door," Arthur commanded. He threw the Mustang into park, popped the trunk, and stepped out into the storm. The rain hit him like cold gravel. He was soaked to the bone in seconds. He waded to the back of the car, pulled out a heavy-duty steel tow cable with massive forged hooks on either end, and trudged down the incline into the floodwater. The water was freezing. It smelled of gasoline and raw sewage. Arthur reached the Maybach. The driver looked at him, panicked and shivering. "The electrics are dead. Everything is dead. The water is sealing. The door's shut." Arthur ignored him. He waded to the front bumper of the Maybach, ducking his head underwater to feel blindly for the heavy-duty tow hook bolted to the luxury car's frame. He found it. He snapped the steel carabiner into place. He walked around to the rear passenger window and slammed his fist against the tempered glass. Evelyn jumped, dropping her phone. She looked out the window. Her immaculate hair was slightly frizzy, her eyes wide with genuine fear. When she saw Arthur's face through the rain, her expression shifted from terror to utter confusion. She recognized him. The janitor. The man with the junk car. Arthur pointed to the tow cable, then pointed up the steep, wet embankment. He mouthed the words, "Hold on." Evelyn shook her head frantically. She rolled down the window just a crack. "You can't pull this car!" she screamed over the roaring wind. "It weighs 3 tons! The incline is pure mud!" "You'll snap your axle and trap us both." "Roll up the window, Miss Hayes," Arthur yelled back. "You're letting the poverty in." He didn't wait for her reaction. He turned and waded back out of the water, dragging the heavy steel cable behind him. He hooked the other end to the reinforced subframe of the Mustang. Arthur climbed back into the driver's seat. He was dripping wet, shivering, his uniform clinging to his skin. He looked at Leo. "Put your seatbelt on tight, buddy." Arthur reached under the dashboard. He flipped 3 toggle switches hidden beneath the steering column. The matte black LCD screen flared a bright, angry red. Warning. Kinetic bypass engaged. Safety limiters off. Until this moment, Arthur had never fully unchained the engine. He had run it at 10% capacity. If he gave it full throttle, the torque could tear a standard drive shaft to shrapnel. But he had rebuilt the Mustang's undercarriage with hardened tungsten alloy, specifically for this. He shifted the heavy metal gear lever into first. He looked in his rearview mirror. Through the driving rain, he saw Evelyn Hayes staring at the back of his rusted car, her face pressed near the glass, waiting for the inevitable failure. Arthur pressed the accelerator. The Mustang didn't rev. It didn't roar. It shrieked. It was a terrifying, ear-splitting sound, a high-frequency magnetic scream that shattered the heavy drumming of the rain. The air pressure immediately around the car dropped violently, creating a visible halo of mist as the water vapor condensed around the hood. The tires dug into the wet mud of the embankment. For a split second, they spun. Then, the magnetic resonance core locked into its feedback loop. The massive, instantaneous torque slammed into the rear axle. The heavy steel tow cable snapped completely taut with a violent crack, vibrating like a guitar string under impossible tension. Inside the Maybach, Evelyn was thrown back into her leather seat. Her eyes went wide as saucers. The massive dead weight of her 3-ton electric fortress was violently jerked forward. Outside, the rusted Mustang was performing a physical impossibility. Arthur's foot was buried in the floorboards. The engine's shriek escalated into a deafening, continuous roar of raw synthetic power. The Mustang didn't struggle. It didn't slip. It clawed its way up the slick, 45-degree mud embankment, dragging the dead Maybach out of the floodwater as if it weighed nothing at all. The ground beneath the Mustang's tires literally baked dry. The immense thermal discharge from the localized kinetic friction instantly vaporized the rainwater, leaving a trail of dry, cracked, smoking asphalt in the car's wake. Arthur steered them onto the high, dry section of the overpass. He eased off the throttle. The terrifying scream of the engine spun down rapidly, returning to its disguised, rattling sub-bass hum. Arthur unbuckled his seatbelt, stepped out into the rain, and unhooked the cable from the Maybach. The heavy doors of the luxury car swung open. Evelyn stepped out into the rain, heedless of the water ruining her suit. She ignored her shivering driver. She walked slowly to the front of her car and stared at the back of the rusted Mustang. She looked at the smoking, dry tire tracks burned into the wet pavement. She looked at Arthur. Her mouth was slightly open. The aristocratic sneer was gone. The cold detachment was gone. She looked at him the way a person looks at a magic trick they know isn't a trick.
"What?"
Evelyn stammered, pointing a shaking finger at the rusted hood of his car. The rain was plastering her hair to her face. "What is in that car?" Arthur threw the heavy steel cable into his trunk and slammed it shut. He wiped the rain from his eyes and looked at the billionaire. He didn't smile. He didn't boast. He just looked tired. "Junk, Miss Hayes," Arthur said, his voice cutting through the storm. "Just a decaying piece of trash." He got back into the Mustang, put it in gear, and drove away, leaving the CEO standing in the rain, staring at his taillights, realizing she had just insulted the man holding the future of her entire industry. Evelyn Hayes did not sleep that night. She sat in the cavernous, glass-walled penthouse of the Apex Tower, wrapped in a silk robe, staring at a high-resolution photograph on her tablet. It was a picture of the I-95 overpass, taken by her security team 2 hours after the storm broke. Where the rusted Mustang had clawed its way up the embankment, the asphalt was fundamentally altered. It wasn't just dry. The aggregate rock in the pavement had been scorched white. The tar binder melted and re-solidified into a glass-like sheen. Her chief engineer, a nervous man named Miller, sat across from her on a white leather sofa. He looked nauseous.
"The math doesn't exist, Evelyn," Miller said, his voice thin. He rubbed his temples. "We ran the dashcam footage through the physics engine. To generate the localized torque required to pull 6,000 pounds up a 45-degree mud incline without wheel slippage, the thermal discharge alone should have melted the car's frame. It should have exploded. The kinetic output defies the current laws of thermodynamics." Evelyn didn't look up from the tablet. She zoomed in on the scorch marks. She remembered the high-pitched, magnetic shriek. It hadn't sounded like machinery. It had sounded like the tearing of physical space. "Who is he?" she asked softly. "Arthur Pendleton," Miller read from a file. 42, hired as subcontract maintenance 3 years ago. But before that, he was a senior theoretical propulsion architect at Omnitech. He held 12 patents. 5 years ago, Omnitech buried him in litigation over a proprietary magnetic drive concept, bankrupted him, His wife got sick around the same time. He lost everything. Dropped completely off the grid. Evelyn set the tablet face down on the glass table. The clink echoed in the silent room. She had looked right at him. She had looked at the calloused hands holding the mop, the frayed collar of his uniform, the rusted hood of his car, and she had seen a failure. She prided herself on reading the market, on seeing the invisible lines of value that others missed, and she had looked at a $2 billion paradigm shift and told it to scrub the floor twice. A tight, cold knot formed in her stomach. It wasn't guilt. It was the terrifying realization of her own vulnerability. If Arthur Pendleton walked into a competitor's lobby tomorrow morning, Apex Industries would be obsolete in 5 years. "Cancel my morning meetings," Evelyn said, standing up. She walked toward her dressing room. "Where are you going?" Miller asked. "To apologize to a piece of junk." Arthur was standing at the kitchen sink, staring blankly out the window at the overgrown backyard. He was drinking instant coffee from a chipped mug. It tasted like burnt pennies. His lower back was throbbing. The adrenaline of the storm had faded, leaving a heavy, toxic residue of panic in its wake. He had exposed the engine. He had broken his one rule. Now the ticking clock in his head was deafening. He needed to pack the car. He needed to pull Leo out of school and drive 3 states over. If Apex had any competent engineers, they would be pulling the overpass footage right now. He rinsed the mug, the tepid tap water splashing against his knuckles. A heavy knock sounded at the front door. Arthur froze. He slowly dried his hands on a dish towel. He walked into the narrow living room, stepping over a pile of Leo's plastic dinosaurs, and pulled back the faded curtain of the front window. A sleek black SUV was parked on the cracked concrete of his driveway. Arthur opened the door. Evelyn Hayes stood on his sagging wooden porch. She wasn't wearing an ivory pantsuit today. She wore a dark, heavy trench coat that cost more than Arthur's duplex. The sharp morning light caught the subtle tension in her jaw. She looked entirely out of place, a hawk perched on a chain-link fence. She breathed in, smelling the damp rot of the porch and the faint odor of cheap laundry detergent coming from the screen door. Her nose wrinkled for a fraction of a second before she forced her features into a neutral, practiced mask. "Mr. Pendleton," she said. Arthur didn't open the screen door. He stood in the shadows of the hallway, his arms crossed. "You're out of your zip code, Miss Hayes. The VIP parking is a few miles south." Evelyn didn't blink. She appreciated the hostility. It was a language she understood. "May I come in?" "No." She nodded slowly. "Fair enough. Omnitech stole your life's work, bankrupted your family, and forced you into a janitorial uniform. You have every right to despise corporate executives. I would." Arthur's jaw tightened. He felt a cold sweat break out on the back of his neck. "She knows. I don't despise you," Arthur said, his voice flat. "I just don't care about you. There's a difference. I saw the scorch marks on the asphalt, Arthur. I had my engineers run the telemetry. You've built a closed-loop magnetic resonance engine. You've bypassed the lithium grid dependency. You've solved the localized thermal discharge problem in a garage with scavenged parts. I don't know what you're talking about. I drive a '69 Ford. It needs a new carburetor." Evelyn stepped closer to the screen door. The aristocratic arrogance was gone, replaced by a raw, predatory hunger. "I have $50 million in a discretionary acquisitions fund. I can have a wire transfer routed into your personal account before your son finishes his lunch at school today. For the car. And the blueprints." Arthur stared at her. $50 million. The number hung in the damp morning air. It was a life-altering, staggering amount of money. It was college for Leo. It was a house with a roof that didn't leak. It was a doctor for his back. His hands began to shake slightly. He shoved them deep into the pockets of his jeans so she wouldn't see. He looked at the billionaire on his porch. He remembered the gray mop water. He remembered the smell of the VIP garage. He remembered the way she had looked at his car, and by extension, at him. "Why do you people insist on keeping things that are broken?" Arthur let out a harsh, dry laugh. It startled Evelyn. 50 million, Arthur repeated, shaking his head.
He pushed the screen door open, stepping out onto the porch. He towered over her, the physical exhaustion of the last 5 years radiating from him like heat. You ran the math, Miss Hayes. Don't insult me. If that engine goes into mass production, it decapitates the global fossil fuel supply chain. It ends the electric vehicle battery monopoly. 50 million is a tip. It's what you pay to make a problem go away. Evelyn held her ground, though her eyes narrowed. You're a janitor with a rusted car and zero infrastructure. You don't have the capital to patent it, let alone manufacture it. You try to take that to market yourself, Omnitech will bury you in IP lawsuits until you die of old age. 50 million is freedom. I don't want freedom, Arthur said, leaning in. I want equity. He walked past her, his heavy boots thudding against the rotting wood of the porch. He headed down the driveway toward the detached garage in the back. Evelyn hesitated for a second, then turned and followed him, the hem of her expensive coat dragging against the overgrown weeds. The garage was cold. It smelled intensely of ozone, burnt tungsten, and old vinyl. Arthur grabbed the heavy steel handle of the roll-up door and heaved it open. The morning light spilled into the dusty space, illuminating the bruised primer-gray body of the Mustang. It sat there, quiet, unassuming, still caked in the mud from the overpass. Evelyn walked in slowly. She approached the car as if it were an unexploded bomb. She stopped at the front grille, looking down at the crumpled fender. Arthur walked over and popped the hood. He pushed it up, the rusted hinges screaming in protest. Evelyn gasped softly. Beneath the rusted exterior, the magnetic resonance core pulsed with a faint, residual blue light. The titanium housing was immaculate, a stark, jarring contrast to the decaying shell of the car. It was beautiful. It was terrifying. I built the housing from aerospace scrap I bought at a junkyard by the pound, Arthur said quietly, staring at the engine. The induction coils are wound from copper wiring I pulled out of demolished office buildings. It took me 4 years, working between midnight shifts. Evelyn reached out, her manicured fingers hovering an inch above the cold titanium. She didn't touch it. She was vibrating with a specific kind of corporate adrenaline. It's the most brilliant piece of engineering I've ever seen, she whispered. It was the first genuine thing she had said to him. It's a $2 billion asset, Miss Hayes. Minimum. Arthur picked up a greasy shop rag from the workbench and began wiping his hands, a nervous habit. And I'm not selling it to you. Evelyn snapped her head up. The executive returned. Everyone has a price, Arthur. I'm licensing it to you, Arthur corrected, his voice hardening. I retain 49% equity in the subsidiary formed to manufacture it. I retain full operational control over the engineering prototypes. Apex handles the litigation, the manufacturing, and the global distribution. And my name goes on the patent. Not Apex, Pendleton. Evelyn stared at him. The terms were draconian. They were insulting to a CEO of her stature. She was used to buying desperate men out for pennies on the dollar. But Arthur wasn't desperate anymore. He had seen her dead in the water, and he had dragged her out. He knew exactly what he possessed. 49% is absurd, she fired back, her voice echoing off the concrete walls. Apex assumes all the risk. We front the capital. We fight the wars in court. 10% royalty and a seat on the advisory board. 49, Arthur repeated, tossing the greasy rag onto the workbench. Or, I drive this car to Germany on a cargo ship tonight, and I let Apex Industries become a footnote in a history book. They stood in the cold garage, locked in a brutal, silent standoff. The air felt heavy. Evelyn looked at Arthur. She saw the dark circles under his eyes, the graying hair, the cheap, stained clothes. But she also saw the titanium core behind him. She realized, with a bitter, cynical clarity, that she had no leverage. He didn't care about her world. He didn't want a penthouse. He just wanted to win. There was a specific sound a billionaire makes when they realize they have been entirely defeated. It isn't a scream. It's an exhale. A slow, measured deflation. Evelyn let out a long breath. Her shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch. 49%, she said, the words tasting like ash in her mouth, and a joint venture on the patents. Arthur stared at her for a long time. The tension in his chest, a knot he had carried for 5 years, slowly began to loosen. It physically hurt to let it go. He felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to sit down and cry, to sleep for a week, but he held his posture stiff. "Deal," Arthur said. He didn't offer his hand. Evelyn Hayes, the CEO of Apex Industries, stepped forward and extended hers. Arthur looked at it. He reached out and gripped her hand. His skin was rough, calloused, and stained with permanent grease. Hers was soft and cold. It was the handshake that would upend the global economy. "I'll have my legal team draft the preliminary contracts by this evening," Evelyn said, stepping back. She looked at the Mustang one last time. A small, complicated smile touched the corner of her mouth. "You're going to need a better car, Arthur." Arthur turned and looked at the rusted '69 fastback. He thought about the gray water in the mop bucket. He thought about Leo sleeping under the thin plaid blanket in the passenger seat. "No," Arthur said softly. "This one runs just fine." Evelyn turned and walked out of the garage, the expensive fabric of her coat swishing against the door frame. The black SUV started up and rolled down the cracked driveway, disappearing down the decaying street. Arthur stood alone in the quiet garage. The blue light of the engine pulsed softly. He walked over to the car, placed his calloused hand flat against the rusted, pitted metal of the hood, and slowly, finally, closed it. The line between a piece of junk and a revolution is usually just the person brave enough to turn the key. If Arthur's gritty fight for survival and his $2 billion revenge hit home for you, drop a like and share this story with someone who needs a reminder to never underestimate the underdog. Subscribe to the channel for more raw, grounded stories of human resilience. What would you have done with the engine? Let me know in the comments below.